Before we begin tonight's quiet journey into forgotten history, if my voice brings you even a little peace, you're welcome to subscribe. It helps me keep making these slow, gentle stories for you. Imagine, if you will, a silence so deep it feels heavy against your chest. You are lying in the dark, roughly 600 years ago. The walls around you are not made of drywall or timber, but of 3-foot thick limestone, quarried from the cold earth. Outside, a winter storm howls across the moors, but inside, the air is still and deadly cold. Your breath comes out in thick white clouds that drift toward the high shadowed ceiling. How did we, a species born of the sun-drenched savanna, end up sleeping inside these stone iceboxes without freezing to death? To understand the secret of the medieval night, we must peel back the layers of history, past the knights and kings, all the way back to the first fire in a dark cave. To understand the sleep of our ancestors, we must first understand the room in which they lay. We must strip away the modern comforts of central heating, double-glazed windows, and fiberglass insulation. We must transport our minds back, drifting through the currents of time, past the Industrial Revolution, past the Age of Enlightenment, settling deep into the heavy, gray silence of the medieval period. Imagine, if you will, that you are standing in the center of a bedchamber in the year 1250. It is night. The room is not small. In fact, it is cavernous. But the darkness makes it feel intimate, or perhaps confining. Before you even close your eyes, you feel it. The presence. It is not a ghost, nor an intruder. It is the building itself. You are standing inside a machine made of stone. And this machine has a temperature. The medieval castle, for all its romanticized glory in storybooks and films, was in reality a geological marvel designed for one specific purpose: to be unyielding. It was built to withstand the trebuchet, the battering ram, and the arrow. But in designing a structure that could repel an army, the architects of the Middle Ages accidentally created something else entirely. They created a refrigerator. Let us look closely at the walls. In a modern home, a wall is a hollow thing, a frame of wood, filled with air or fluff, wrapped in thin drywall. It reacts to the sun. It warms up quickly. But here, in the castle, the wall is a curtain wall. The term sounds soft, like fabric, but the reality is monolithic. These walls are 6, sometimes 10 feet thick. They are not solid stone all the way through. That would have been too expensive, even for a king. Instead, they are constructed like a sandwich. The outer face is made of ashlar smooth, cut stone, dressed by masons to fit together with barely a seam. The inner face, the one inside your bedroom, is also cut stone. But between these two heavy skins lies the rubble core. This core is a chaotic mixture of flint, gravel, crushed limestone, and mortar. It is a dense, chaotic mass of earth. When you combine the outer stone, the inner stone, and the rubble core, you possess a massive amount of what physicists call thermal mass. Thermal mass is the property of a material to absorb and store heat energy. Stone is hungry for heat. It is a glutton for it. When you light a fire in a castle room, the air might warm up for a moment, but the walls begin to feed. They suck the thermal energy out of the air, pulling it deep into that 10-foot thickness. The wall is so massive that it acts as a heat sink. It is trying to equalize its temperature with the temperature of the fire, but the wall is simply too big. You could burn a forest in the hearth, and the wall would still feel cool to the touch. This is the stone giant's breath. It is the sensation that the cold is not coming from the window, but radiating, or rather, absorbing from the walls themselves. In the height of summer, this was a blessing. A castle in July is a sanctuary of cool air. But we are concerned with the sleep of winter. Consider the quarry from which these stones came. Perhaps it was a limestone quarry in France, or a granite pit in Wales. These stones spent millions of years underground, compressed by the weight of the earth, sitting at a constant low temperature. When they were cut and hoisted into the air to build a fortress, they carried that memory of the underground with them. Granite, specifically, is a terrible insulator. It is conductive. It acts as a bridge, carrying the freezing temperature of the winter wind outside, right through the 10 feet of rubble, and depositing it onto the inner surface of your bedroom wall. When you lay in bed in a medieval castle, you are essentially sleeping inside a man-made cave. But it is not just the cold. It is the damp. We must talk about the mortar. To bind these millions of tons of stone together, medieval masons used lime mortar. The recipe was ancient: burnt lime, sand, and water. A lot of water. When a great castle was built, let us say, the Tower of London or the great concentric castles of Edward I, the amount of water trapped inside the walls during construction was astronomical. We are talking about thousands of gallons of water mixed into the mortar, sealed inside the thick stone sandwich. It takes time for water to evaporate from stone. A long time. Modern archaeologists and engineers estimate that a large castle keep could take up to 20 years for its walls to fully dry out after construction. 20 years. Imagine sleeping in a room where the walls are slowly exhaling the moisture of 2 decades. The air in a medieval bedroom was rarely dry. It was heavy, laden with invisible droplets. In the winter, this dampness settled on everything. The bed linens, the tapestries, the wood of the bed frame, everything would have a slight, clammy film to it. Cold air is one thing. Dry cold can be managed. You can wrap up in wool and warm up. But damp cold is insidious. It bypasses the wool. It seeps into the fibers. It touches the skin and evaporates, stealing body heat much faster than dry air ever could. This was the bone chill written about in old Texas, cold that seemed to bypass the flesh and settle in the skeleton. So, the stage is set. You are enclosed in 10 feet of wet, heat-absorbing rock. But surely, you might think, they could just close the window. Here lies the second tragedy of castle engineering. The battle between light and defense. In the early medieval period, the 11th and 12th centuries, windows as we know them did not exist. A window was a structural weakness. If you make a hole in the wall big enough to let in sunlight, you have also made a hole big enough for an enemy to climb through, or for a catapult stone to smash. Therefore, the windows in a sleeping chamber were often nothing more than arrow loops or lancets. These were narrow vertical slits, perhaps only 4 inches wide on the outside, flaring inward to allow an archer to aim his bow. These slits had no glass. Glass was a rare, precious jewel, reserved for the cathedrals of God, not the houses of men. For centuries, the window was simply a hole in the rock. To close it, you had wooden shutters. Heavy oak boards, reinforced with iron. When the winter storms howled across the moors, you would slam these shutters tight and bar them. But wood warps. Iron rusts. Stone shifts. The seal was never perfect. The wind would find the gaps. It would whistle through the cracks in the shutter, creating a draft. A draft in a stone room is a curious thing. It does not just blow across the room. It circulates. The cold air enters, heavier than the slightly warmer air inside. It sinks immediately to the floor. It spreads out like water, creating a lake of freezing air at ankle height. As the air warms slightly from the weak fire, it rises, only to hit the freezing stone ceiling, cool down and fall again. This created a constant, invisible convective cycle, a slow motion tornado of chill air that rotated silently around the sleeper all night long. There was a specific smell to this cold. If you were to breathe in the air of a 13th century castle bedroom, you would smell the mineral dust of the stone. You would smell the acrid, biting scent of wood smoke that never quite escaped the chimney. You would smell the musty, wet dog odor of damp wool and old straw. But mostly, you would smell the cold. It has a scent, sharp and metallic, like old iron left out in the snow. Why did they build them this way? Why did humans, a species that evolved on the warm savannas of Africa, voluntarily stack stones to create iceboxes to sleep in? The answer lies in the hierarchy of needs. For the medieval mind, the fear of the cold was secondary to the fear of the blade. The castle was not a home. It was a bunker. The lord and lady accepted the freezing temperatures because the thickness of the walls meant safety. They traded thermal comfort for security. There is a primitive logic to it, echoing back to our very first ancestors. Think of the cavemen. They left the open plains to sleep in deep limestone caves. Caves are naturally cold, usually hovering around 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 degrees Celsius year-round. But the cave offered a single defensible entrance. It offered a solid back wall that nothing could dig through. We are, historically speaking, cave dwellers. The medieval nobility were merely cave dwellers with better clothes. They built artificial mountains and hollowed them out. They accepted the stone giant's breath as the price of survival. However, the human body is frail. It cannot maintain its core temperature of 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit when surrounded by ambient temperatures that could drop to freezing. Hypothermia is a silent killer. In the deep of the night, as the metabolism slows down during sleep, the body produces less heat. If the stone walls drain that heat away faster than the body can produce it, the heart will eventually stop. So, a battle line was drawn. On one side, the castle, a millions-ton entity of wet lime, freezing granite, and drafting winds, designed by the laws of physics to drain the life out of anything warm. On the other side, the human, a soft, warm-blooded creature, armed only with ingenuity and the desperate need to close its eyes for 8 hours. This was not a battle fought with swords. It was a battle fought with textiles. It was a war of insulation. It was a struggle that would lead to the invention of complex canopies, the strategic use of heated bricks, the layering of furs, and the communal pile of bodies out as the sun set over the battlements in the deep midwinter, and the temperature outside plummeted. The castle would begin to creak as the stones contracted in the frost. Inside, the preparations for the night would begin. It was a ritual of survival. The bedroom was not just a room. It was the arena. And the first challenge was to conquer the floor. You see, the floor of a castle chamber was usually flagstone flat slabs of rock laid directly over the earth or over a stone vault. To step out of bed onto the floor barefoot in December was to risk frostbite. The cold of the ground was infinite, and so, before they could even think of sleeping, they had to insulate the world beneath their feet. This leads us to the humble rush, the dried plant stems scattered across the floors, the first layer of defense in the long war against the stone. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. For now, just lie there in the dark. Listen to the wind howling outside the arrow loop. Feel the weight of the 3-foot walls pressing in. Feel the dampness in the air, tasting of lime and rain. The stone giant is breathing. It is waiting to take your warmth. How did they survive this? How did they turn this tomb into a womb? The answer begins not with the stone, but with the fire. But not the roaring fireplaces you see in movies. No. The reality of heating these stone leviathans was far more smoky, far more difficult, and far more fascinating. As the draft swirls around your ankles and the stone sucks the heat from your breath, we must look toward the hearth and realize that for thousands of years, we were doing it wrong. In the cold, damp silence of the castle chamber, after the stone giant has had its introduction and the chill has settled deep into the air, we turn now from the hard physics of stone to the soft winding pathways of the human mind. We move from the architecture of defense to the psychology of survival. If Chapter 1 explained why the castle was cold, this chapter seeks to answer a more fundamental question. Why did people feel safe enough to sleep there at all? Sleep, that most vulnerable state, is a profound act of trust. For a fully grown, powerful human being, be it a noble, a knight, or a peasant, to willingly surrender consciousness for hours, they must be convinced, deep within their ancient mammalian brain, that the world cannot harm them while they are defenseless. This sense of security in the Middle Ages was not derived from a locked door and a good neighborhood. It was derived from an instinct far older than the feudal system, an instinct that echoes the first time an early human crawled into a cave and found peace. Let us journey back. Not 6 centuries, but 60,000 years. We are standing on the cusp of the Paleolithic era. Our ancestors were fragile beings, surrounded by creatures far stronger, faster, and equipped with teeth and claws. When night fell, darkness was not just the absence of light. It was a hungry, moving thing, filled with predators. The primary human response to darkness was vulnerability and fear. To counter this, early humans sought out spaces that maximized the effort required by a predator to reach them. These spaces invariably were caves. A cave offered 3 psychological reassurances that remain wired into our brains today: enclosure, elevation, and defensibility. The comfort of enclosure. Look at the medieval castle bedroom again. The thick stone walls, 10 feet deep, are not merely physical barriers. They are psychological cocoons. They replicate the fundamental experience of the cave. The cave dweller knew that the immense weight of the rock above them meant that nothing could drop down onto them. The massive walls surrounding them meant that nothing could claw its way in from the side. The medieval sleeper inherited this feeling. Every pound of stone, every foot of wall thickness, translates directly in the human psyche into a fraction of security. The thickness is a guarantee. It screams, nothing of the outside world can breach this space while you sleep. This is the psychological principle of the fortress within. Even if a castle were breached, the inner chamber, especially the Lord's room high up in the keep, became its own second layer of safety, a rock-solid, enclosed retreat. This enclosure allowed the body to enter the deep relaxation necessary for restorative sleep. Precisely because the primitive alarm system was temporarily shut down by the sheer mass of the surrounding material. It is why, even today, in our perfectly safe modern homes, we still prefer heavy curtains, feeling more protected when the window, our most vulnerable point, is shrouded. We are replicating the primitive need to seal the hole in the wall. The power of elevation. The Lord's ledge in the Paleolithic cave. The safest place to sleep was not on the main floor. It was on a ledge, a shelf, or a raised platform. Elevation provides 2 immediate, primal advantages: defense against ground-hugging predators. It put the sleeper out of the immediate reach of snakes, crawling insects, and lower-level scavengers. Visual command. Even in the dim light of a small fire, sleeping on a ledge allowed the sleeper to look down upon the main entrance, retaining a psychological sense of command and early warning. The medieval castle translated this primal need directly into its architecture. The most important chambers, the private apartments. The bedchambers of the lord and lady were never on the ground floor. They were elevated, often on the 2nd or 3rd floor of the keep, accessible only by a single winding stone stairway. This winding stair itself was a relic of primitive defense, usually turning clockwise so that a right-handed, ascending attacker could not swing his sword effectively against the inner wall. To sleep in the main bed of the castle was to sleep on the Lord's ledge. You were physically elevated above the danger, mirroring the safest spot in the ancient cave. This elevation, coupled with the surrounding stone mass, was the ultimate psychological tranquilizer for the medieval brain. It was a perfect, artificially constructed environment for evolutionary sleep safety. Defensibility. The one-way view in the cave. The ultimate defensibility was achieved by finding a narrow bottleneck entrance, a point where the human could stand firebrand in hand, and funnel any attacker into a single, vulnerable line. The castle applied this principle with architectural precision. The narrow arrow loops and lancet windows, which made the room so miserably cold, also made it utterly defensible. The arrow loop, as we discussed, was 4 inches wide outside, flaring inward. This meant the defender had a wide field of fire outward, while the attacker faced a virtually impenetrable slit. This is the one-way view of security. When the heavy wooden shutters were barred for the night, the medieval sleeper knew they had engineered a structure that required an enormous concerted effort to breach. The small high windows, the thick walls, the single barred door, all of it created a low stimulation, high security sensory environment that told the brain, you are safe to rest. This is the mysterious charm of the castle's severity. Its very starkness, its lack of soft domesticity, made it a better defense mechanism, and therefore a psychologically superior sleeping environment than a frail wooden house. The power of proximity, the scent of safety, but the need for security extended beyond the walls. It involved the other humans in the room. In the Paleolithic era, sleeping alone was an invitation to death. The safest place was in the center of the communal pile. There was safety in numbers, shared body heat, and the collective senses of the group. If one person stirred, the others were warned. This is a behavior known as co-sleeping for defense, observed across many social mammals. The medieval castle did not eliminate this primitive behavior. It formalized it. The great lord might have his private chamber, but he rarely slept alone. We often picture the medieval royal bedchamber as a private, romantic space. The reality is that it was more akin to a slightly partitioned barracks. The chamber might contain the enormous 4-poster bed for the lord and lady, but it also held the chamberlain, a high-ranking servant, who slept on a trundle bed or a pallet near the door to guard it. It contained grooms of the chamber who slept on benches or straw near the fireplace to keep the fire banked. Often, the favored pet hunting dog slept on the rushes on the floor. This proximate sleeping was not just a lack of privacy. It was a form of primitive security blanket. The sound of other humans breathing, the presence of the chamberlains, it all provided a background hum of collective vigilance. The soundscape of the room was comforting because it was not silent. Absolute silence meant absolute vulnerability. The sound of soft snoring, the shifting of a dog, the gentle crackle of the embers, these were the white noise of survival. They signaled that the group was safe, and therefore, the individual was safe. The primitive brain could relax because its social safety net was physically present and accounted for. The ritual of the gate, sealing the perimeter. Before the Lord went to bed, a series of complex, almost religious closing rituals took place across the entire castle complex. These were not just practical steps. They were essential psychological markers. Think of the ceremony of closing the great portcullis, the immense iron gate that dropped down into its slots. The sound, a deep, resonant clunk echoing through the stone courtyard, was the auditory equivalent of the cave entrance being sealed. Then came the closing of the thick, iron-bound wooden doors of the inner keep. The slamming home of the immense iron bars and bolts, sounds that traveled up the stone shaft of the turret and into the chamber. These sounds were a psychological countdown. Each thud and scrape and clang signaled the drawing of the boundaries. It was the public, ceremonial declaration that the entire perimeter was sealed. These rituals allowed the medieval mind to transition from the daytime state of vigilance to the nighttime state of rest, just as the modern person checks their deadbolt multiple times. The medieval sleeper relied on these audible and felt reassurances that the structure they were inside had become a single, impenetrable rock, detached from the dangers of the freezing world outside. The mystery of the dark. Finally, we must consider the nature of darkness itself in the medieval age. We live in a world saturated with light pollution. our darkness is gray and diluted. The medieval night, particularly inside a castle with thick walls and narrow windows, was absolute. It was a total, sensory deprivation darkness, but the castle dweller had conquered this darkness in one tiny spot, the hearth. Even after the flames had been banked for the night, a small glow would persist, the deep red pulsing heart of the embers. The heat was negligible, but the light was everything. This single small, reddish glow in the corner of the room was the descendant of the first Paleolithic fire. Fire, to the ancient human, was not just warmth. It was a psychological weapon against the night. It was the only thing that kept the outside terrors at bay. Its flickering light was the boundary of civilization. The sleeping arrangement of the castle room, with the large bed, positioned to maximize the distance from the drafty windows, and the presence of the small glowing hearth, was a direct, architectural echo of the earliest human survival strategy: huddle in the deepest, most defensible part of the cave, and keep the fire alive. The lord and lady, wrapped in their furs and nestled within their curtained bed, were not just a noble couple. They were the alpha members of a small, primitive family unit, gathered around the dying embers, guarded by massive rock walls, recreating the conditions that allowed their species to survive the long, frozen nights of the Ice Age. The very architecture of the castle, so cold, so severe, so dark, was, paradoxically, the ultimate psychological balm. It forced the inhabitant to confront the primitive need for safety, and then satisfied it with millions of tons of stone. This understanding of primitive psychology is crucial, for it informs the next chapter: the practical, ingenious, and occasionally dangerous methods they employed to turn their defensive rock boxes into truly warm places to sleep. They had the psychology of safety, but they still needed the physics of heat. We must now leave the cave and return to the room, ready to examine the central heating system of the castle, the great hall's hearth, and the surprising difficulties they had in simply getting the smoke to go up. We have explored the physics of the stone walls, the silent, heat-devouring giant that was the castle itself. We have drifted through the psychological landscape, understanding the deep, primal comfort that millions of tons of stone offered to the medieval mind. Now, it is time to face the most crucial and most persistently mismanaged element of castle living: fire. Fire is the original miracle. It is the defining technological leap that separated Homo sapiens from all other creatures, granting us a portable, controllable summer in the deepest winter. But the integration of fire into permanent, enclosed architecture, the domestication of the flame, was a clumsy, smoky, and often disastrous affair that took millennia to perfect. The story of the medieval hearth is not a romantic tale of crackling logs. It is a fascinating, frustrating lesson in fluid dynamics and architectural compromise. The Paleolithic prototype, the center of the circle. Our story begins, as always, with our distant ancestors. In the earliest communal dwellings, the skin-covered huts of the Mesolithic era, or the lawn houses of the Neolithic, the fire pit, or the hearth, was placed precisely in the center of the structure. There was deep, practical logic to this. By placing the fire in the middle, the heat radiated equally in all directions, maximizing warmth for the entire group huddling around it. The smoke, the inevitable byproduct, was allowed to drift straight up to a hole in the roof, a simple, rough opening that let the toxic fumes escape into the atmosphere. This central hearth was the social and physical heart of the home. It defined the space. And for centuries, this was the model for large buildings. When the Normans began building the first great stone keeps in England and France in the 11th century, the architectural blueprint for the largest room, the Great Hall, was borrowed directly from this primitive model. The Great Hall was the communal dining room, the courtroom, the meeting space, and often the mass sleeping area for servants and soldiers. The Great Hall's central fire pit in the earliest castles The great hall had a massive central fire pit. This pit was often a foot or two deep, lined with stone or brick, and placed directly in the middle of the floor, beneath the high ceiling. And here, the problems began. While this central position maximized the dispersal of heat, it failed utterly in controlling the smoke. The simple roof hole, or louver, worked fine for a low, timber hut. But in a massive stone hall, perhaps 40 or 50 feet high, the dynamics of air and stone created chaos. The stone giant's breath, which we discussed in Chapter 1, complicated everything. The massive cold walls pulled the heat away from the fire. As the heat rose, it hit the cold air rushing in through the roof hole, or perhaps through the high, drafty windows. This combination of cold stone and cross drafts meant that the rising column of smoke, instead of exiting neatly, would often get cooled, condense, and swirl back down. The effect was a perpetually smoky room. Imagine the atmosphere: a great hall, dimly lit by the central fire and a few sputtering rushlights. The air is heavy, acrid, and gray. Servants and knights are coughing, their eyes red and streaming. The Lord himself sits on his dais, constantly blinking, the smoke clinging to the woolen tapestries and coating the wooden timbers in a layer of soot. This was not just an inconvenience. It was a health hazard. Smoke inhalation, especially over years of residency, caused chronic lung problems. It was an accepted cost of being warm and safe. The very name of the room we call a chimney today. The word chimney actually comes from the Latin word caminus, which originally meant a simple hearth or furnace. The complex structure we now associate with smoke removal had yet to be invented. The great leap sideways, the mural fireplace, the shift that transformed the medieval interior, was not a sudden invention, but a slow, practical realization. The fire must be moved to the wall. Sometime around the 12th and 13th centuries, architects began to understand that if the fire could be placed against a wall, the smoke could be directed into a dedicated, vertical channel carved into the thick stone structure. This was the birth of the mural fireplace, and with it, the true chimney. This was a major architectural innovation. No longer was the smoke fighting gravity and the open air. Now it was guided by a dedicated flue. This invention transformed the comfort of the castle more than any other single factor, moving large spaces from choking smoke pits to merely drafty ones. The chimney was a triumph of engineering, but it was far from perfect. The construction of a medieval chimney in a castle was a massive undertaking. The flue, the actual smoke passage, had to be carved out of the 10-foot thick wall, twisting its way up to the roof. The sheer volume of stone around it made it work. The fire would heat the stone lining of the flue, which, being warmer than the air outside, would create a lower pressure zone, sucking the smoke upwards, a phenomenon known as the draft effect. But the design introduced new problems, particularly the heat loss paradox. When you place a fire against a thick stone wall, the law of thermal mass reasserts itself immediately. The back wall of the fireplace, which is the thick castle wall, becomes a colossal, unquenchable heat sink. The fire is burning, radiating heat into the room. But at the same time, the stones immediately behind the fire are absorbing vast amounts of thermal energy, pulling it deep into the wall structure, and ultimately radiating it harmlessly to the outside world. The fireplace became, essentially, a giant exhaust fan for heat. It was sucking the smoke out, which was good, but it was also sucking the room air out, which was bad. The hot air, the only true source of warmth, was pulled up the flue, often creating a vacuum that was filled by cold, outside air rushing in through the ill-fitting doors and windows. So while the room was less smoky, the overall thermal efficiency was abysmal. For every 1 unit of heat that warmed the people, perhaps 10 units were lost up the chimney or absorbed by the stone. The role of the fireplace hood to combat this inefficiency and the lingering, Problem of downdrafts. The medieval fireplace evolved a critical feature, the hood. If you look at period drawings of large hall fireplaces, you will see an imposing, conical or square structure made of stone or plastered wood that juts out over the fire and funnels the smoke toward the flue opening. This was the hood. The hood served several functions, focusing the smoke. It physically contained and directed the smoke stream, preventing it from curling into the room, reflecting radiant heat. A well-designed hood, especially if plastered, could reflect a small amount of the fire's radiant heat back down into the room, where it was most needed. Psychological hearth. It visually framed the fire, making it the clear, dominant feature of the wall and drawing the eye, giving the fire a sense of place and control. However, the size of the fireplace remained a persistent issue. To heat a massive, high-ceilinged great hall made entirely of cold stone, the fire had to be immense. Logs were often the size of small trees. This required prodigious amounts of fuel, a constant logistical drain on the lord's lands, necessitating dedicated woodcutters and haulers. The sheer scale of the operation meant that the great hall was only warm when the fire was burning fiercely. As soon as the flames died down and the embers cooled, the cold stone would immediately reassert its dominance, and the hall would revert to a state of near-freezing chill. The transition to the chamber hearth. The true innovation for personal comfort came when the fireplace was shrunk and moved out of the communal great hall and into the smaller, private chamber, the very room where the lord and lady slept. These chamber fireplaces, though smaller, were the most efficient because the rooms they heated were smaller and less drafty relative to the hall. The sleeping chamber fireplace became the most critical thermal zone in the entire castle. It was in these small fireplaces that the most ingenious tricks of medieval heat management were employed. The fire dog and the heat shield. Iron fire dogs, andirons, were used to lift the logs off the stone floor, allowing air to circulate beneath, creating a hotter, more efficient burn. Sometimes, a metal sheet or large stone slab would be placed vertically behind the fire to act as a heat reflector, shielding the main stone wall from the fire and directing more radiant heat into the room. Banking the fire. A crucial nightly ritual was banking the fire. Before the servants left the chamber for the night, they would rake the glowing embers into a compact pile and cover them thickly with a layer of insulating ash. This wasn't meant to warm the room. It was done to preserve a single tiny core of heat until morning. This core, sometimes covered by an inverted metal pan or curfew from the French couvre-feu, meaning cover fire, ensured that in the freezing pre-dawn hours, the servants could return, quickly blow the ash away, and immediately rekindle a flame without the effort of striking sparks. This banked fire was the absolute, non-negotiable insurance against perishing in the night. The stone bench. In the best-designed castles of the 14th century, the chimney was sometimes routed horizontally for a short distance before going vertical. This horizontal run, if built into the back of a stone bench, would create a localized, warm spot. A small, heated niche where the resident could sit and truly feel warmth, a medieval version of a heated seat, utilizing the waste heat of the rising smoke. Ultimately, the Great Hall's hearth represents a transition point in human technological history. It was the messy, smoky period where we moved from the primitive efficiency of the central open fire to the structural integration of the wall fireplace. It was a step away from a world of choking smoke, but a step deeper into the physics of heat loss. It taught the medieval human a profound lesson, that the stone giant was not easily tamed. The only heat that mattered was the heat you could keep contained and close to your body. The fireplace, for all its smoke and inefficiency, was the psychological heart. It was the sacred flame that signaled that the humans were still in control. Even when the thermometer plunged, this fundamental struggle, the failure of the wall-mounted Heat source to warm the entire stone shell led directly to the next great innovation in sleeping comfort. If the room could not be heated, then the bed must be turned into a room. As the scent of the banked fire's smoke fades from the high ceiling, and the last red glow dies in the ashes, we must now move to the most intimate defense against the castle's cold: the wooden fortress, the tapestry canopy, and the revolutionary piece of furniture that defined medieval sleep. We have walked through the chill of the Great Hall, witnessed the failure of the giant fireplace to conquer the stone, and understood the primitive need for security that the castle architecture provided. The conclusion is inescapable: the medieval castle, for all its strength, was fundamentally incapable of being heated effectively or efficiently. The stone giant always won the war for the air. The lords and ladies who lived in these fortresses learned a profound lesson from this losing battle against the cold. If you cannot heat the fortress, you must build a smaller personal fortress that you can heat. This realization gave birth to one of the most iconic, complex, and vital pieces of furniture in the history of human comfort: the canopy bed, or more formally, the four-poster bed. This was not merely a decorative object. It was a piece of ingenious thermal engineering, a micro-architectural solution to a macro-architectural problem. It was the invention of a personalized microclimate in an otherwise hostile environment. The bed's humiliation. From floor to frame. To appreciate the canopy bed, we must first appreciate the humble origins of medieval sleep. Before the 13th century, a bed was often less a piece of furniture and more a temporary arrangement. In earlier castles and poorer homes, the bed was a straw pallet laid directly on the floor rushes. It was disposable, cheap, and easily cleared away during the day. This placement on the floor, however, violated every rule of thermal and psychological comfort. As Chapter 3 noted, the stone floor was the coldest part of the castle, serving as a sink for all the heavy, chilled air that dropped from the high ceiling. To sleep on the floor was to sleep in the lake of cold. The first step toward the canopy bed was the simple act of elevation. Beds began to be raised onto wooden frames. This small act of elevation immediately moved the sleeper out of the most frigid, draft-laden layer of air near the flagstone floor. The space beneath the bed itself, often filled with stored items or trundle beds for servants, became an insulator. But a simple raised frame was not enough. The chamber itself remained drafty, and the air, though warmer than the floor, was still cold. The sleeper, generating heat, was simply radiating it out into the cavernous cold volume of the room. This heat was immediately absorbed by the surrounding air and sucked up the chimney. The thermal physics of the canopy. True genius arrived with the canopy and the heavy textile hangings. The bed transformed from a frame into a closed wooden box, suspended on 4 robust posts, often carved from oak or walnut. The canopy, the wooden roof, suspended above the frame, became the first and most critical element of the fortress within. The canopy's function was primarily to prevent heat loss through convection and drafting. In a castle room, the warmest air, the exhaled breath of the sleeper. The small amount of heat radiated from the person naturally rises. Without a ceiling, this precious heat rises to the cold, high ceiling of the stone chamber, where it cools and falls back down, perpetuating the miserable convection cycle we discussed. The canopy acts as a thermal ceiling. It arrests the rising air column, trapping a small pocket of warm, exhaled air immediately above the sleeper. This trapped air forms a thin, insulating layer that the body can then reheat, cycle after cycle. The next stage was to enclose the sides. This was achieved with heavy curtains or drapes made of thick, interlined materials: wool, velvet, fustian, or perhaps even silk for the highest nobility. Though the function was always practical, not aesthetic, these drapes were not merely decorative textiles. They were movable walls, designed for a sophisticated form of climate control. when the curtains were drawn tight for the night and tucked around the frame. They created a small, sealed, internal volume, the microclimate. The volume of air inside the bedbox was perhaps a mere 10 cubic meters. As opposed to the hundreds of cubic meters in the rest of the room, the humidifier effect and the stone giant's defeat inside this small volume, a remarkable transformation occurred. The combined body heat of the sleepers, remembering that many people, including the Lord Lady and sometimes small children, shared the bed for both warmth and defense, would rapidly raise the temperature of the trapped air. But the most critical change was the management of moisture. In the main castle room, the air was cold and damp, a miserable combination. Inside the bed curtains, the air quickly became warm and humid. The moisture exhaled by the sleepers, instead of condensing immediately on cold stone, was trapped within the textile walls. Warm, moist air is easier to live in than cold, dry air. Furthermore, the textile walls absorbed some of the room's prevailing dampness, acting as a buffer. The curtained bed created a sensory shield. The sleeper was protected not only from the cold, but from the psychological oppression of the room's clammy chill. The heavy drapes, often lined with materials like coarse linen or cotton, also served as a sophisticated draft shield. The cold wind whistling through the ill-fitting window shutters would have its energy diffused and stopped by the layers of thick fabric before it ever reached the human skin. The constant, insidious swirl of cold air that circulated the castle chamber was brought to a dead stop by the fortress within. In short, the canopy bed was the first reliable form of personal environmental control. It was a testament to the ingenuity of the medieval mind, which, recognizing the failure of its grand architecture, turned to textile engineering for salvation. The architecture of privacy and status while the thermal function was paramount. The canopy bed also rapidly acquired immense social and symbolic meaning. In the Middle Ages, privacy as we understand it, a room dedicated solely to one person and their activities, was practically non-existent. The communal great hall was the norm. The curtained bed, therefore, became the first private space in the castle. When the curtains were drawn, the space within the bedbox became the seat of power, intimacy, and domesticity. It was here that the Lord conducted private meetings, received supplicants, and dealt with family matters, all in an atmosphere of relative warmth and acoustic privacy. The act of drawing the curtains was a symbolic moment. The ruler was retreating from the public world into a personal sphere of authority. The bed itself quickly became the most valuable and ostentatious piece of furniture a noble family owned. The posts were carved with coats of arms and religious figures. The textiles, which were by far the most expensive elements, were rich, dyed in expensive pigments like azure blue or deep crimson, embroidered with gold thread. These textiles were often the only possessions that traveled with the noble family when they moved from one castle to another, demonstrating their wealth and status in every location. The bed was, quite literally, the throne of the night. Its complexity and grandeur directly correlated with the power of the person sleeping inside it. The sensory experience. Sleeping in a cloth-walled box. Imagine the sensory reality of sleeping in this fortress within. The sound, the noise of the castle was muffled. The sounds of servants coughing, dogs shifting, and the distant, metallic thud of a guard's boot on the flagstones, all were absorbed by the heavy wool and velvet. You slept in a world of soft, textile-dampened silence. The light, with the curtains drawn, the darkness inside was absolute, far deeper than the surrounding chamber. Only a faint rosy glow might filter through the fabric from the banked embers in the distant hearth. This darkness promoted deeper, more restorative sleep, free from the visual stimulation of a flickering rushlight, or the shadow play of the moon through the arrow loop. The scent, the air inside the bed smelled of warm humanity, clean linen, and perhaps the subtle herbal scent of the mattress stuffing. It was a confined, familiar, and comforting aroma, a stark contrast to the drafty, smoky, damp stone scent of the room outside. The touch. You were always in contact with textiles. The rough wool of the coverlet, the smooth linen sheet, the thick, absorbing velvet of the curtain hanging inches from your nose. This tactile environment provided a sense of constant, enveloping pressure, which, for the primitive brain, signals warmth and safety. The canopy bed was therefore not just a bed. It was an environment. It was an exercise in selective exclusion. It excluded the cold, the drafts, the unwanted eyes, and the sounds of the castle's business, allowing the medieval sleeper to replicate the isolated safety of the innermost ledge of the Paleolithic cave. The invention of the canopy bed was the final, triumphant statement in the long human history of sleep safety. We started with the immense heavy walls of the castle to protect us from the outside world. We ended with the soft, layered walls of the canopy to protect us from the architecture itself, having created this essential microclimate. The next challenge, the next layer of defense against the chill, was the bedding itself. What materials were required to fill this precious box of warmth? What fabrics, what furs, and what secret ancient techniques did they employ to turn the cold, mineral dampness into the warmth of life? We must now turn our attention from the frame and the curtains to the materials beneath the sleeper, the essential furs, pelts, and ancient wisdom that connected the medieval lord back to the first hunter who slept wrapped in a hide. We have successfully constructed our fortress within the canopy bed. A wooden frame wrapped in heavy cloth, creating a small, defensible pocket of warm, exhaled air. We have defeated the draft and the stone's relentless chill. But a safe, enclosed box is only half the battle. To truly sleep through the medieval winter, the sleeper needs insulation, and to find the ultimate insulator, we must look not to the sophisticated looms of Flanders, but back to the primal materials of the hunt. We now turn our attention to the deepest layer of warmth, the skins of the beast. The use of animal hides for clothing and bedding is the oldest thermal technology known to humankind. It precedes agriculture, pottery, and permanent shelters. For the medieval noble, wrapped in their layers of imported linen and fine wool, the thick fur pelts used in their beds were a direct, tactile link to the raw, visceral survival instincts of their Paleolithic ancestors. The physics of fur, a gift of evolution to understand why furs and pelts were the non-negotiable cornerstone of medieval sleeping. We must understand the ingenious thermal physics of animal hair. A material's ability to insulate is not determined by its weight, but by its ability to trap air. Air is a poor conductor of heat. The trick to keeping warm is creating a vast number of dead air spaces around the body. The animal pelt is a biological masterpiece of this principle. Every individual strand of hair, particularly the soft, thick underfur, creates a micro pocket of still trapped air. When hundreds of thousands of these strands are packed together on a hide, they form an insulating layer of such efficiency that even when the outside temperature plummets far below freezing, the animal's skin temperature remains constant. When a human lies on such a pelt, they are not relying on the thickness of the material itself, but on the millions of tiny air pockets the fur provides. The fur quickly warms up to the body temperature, and then the air within the strands traps that heat, creating a dense, breathable, and almost instantaneous shield against the cold beneath. In the medieval bed, these furs were critical because they were laid hair-side down on the mattress of straw or herbs, providing a barrier between the sleeper and the cold, damp mass of the mattress, or they were used hair-side up as a coverlet, creating an impenetrable thermal seal against the air. The hierarchy of hides, status, and survival. Not all skins were created equal. The choice of pelt in the medieval bed was a complex blend of availability, cost, and the specific thermal properties of the animal. This was the luxurious language of survival. Sheepskin, the foundation. The most common and foundational fur was sheepskin. It was plentiful, relatively cheap, and possessed excellent properties. The wool is dense, crimped, and naturally highly insulating. Furthermore, sheepskin is remarkably resistant to rot and dampness compared to other animal hides, making it ideal for the damp environment of the castle. The lanolin in the wool gives it a natural water repellency. For the common soldier or lower-ranking servant sleeping in the Great Hall, a sheepskin rug was often the entire sum of their bedding. Bear and Wolf, the noble guard, for the lord and lady in the canopy bed. The pelts were often of predatory animals. Bearskins and wolf pelts, while rare, possessed extraordinary thickness and thermal density. They carried a psychological weight as well. To sleep beneath the skin of a beast that symbolized wilderness and power was a subtle, subconscious reminder of human dominance over nature. These were the most luxurious insulators, often draped over the top of the bed as a final heavy thermal layer, keeping the exhaled heat from escaping the curtains. Marten and ermine, the luxury of lightness, for inner layers, especially linings for quilts or the very top sheets. Thinner, softer furs were used. Ermine, the winter coat of the stoat, was perhaps the most prestigious. Its pure white color, tipped with black, became a symbol of nobility and surety, used on the edges of royal mantles. But its use in bedding was practical. It was incredibly soft, light, and surprisingly warm for its weight, providing insulation without the suffocating heaviness of a bear or wolf hide. Coney, rabbit, and fox, the middle ground, more widely available than bears, but more prestigious than sheep, were rabbit, coney, and fox pelts. These were often sewn together in large squares, creating a patchwork blanket known as a coverlet of furs. This method maximized the utility of smaller, lighter skins, creating a functional, beautiful, and highly insulating covering. The preparation of these skins was an ancient craft. The hides were not simply dried. They had to be tanned or dressed using processes that involved brain matter, urine, bark, and alum to make the skin, the leather side, soft and supple, preventing it from cracking and hardening in the cold, damp air. This dressing process, a highly skilled craft usually handled by specialists called towers or parchment makers, was essential for creating a comfortable, flexible sleeping surface. The ancient smell, the sensory memory of survival. One of the often overlooked aspects of this fur-centric sleeping arrangement was the smell. The medieval bedroom, even the noble one, would have possessed a strong primal scent. It was a complex mix of wood smoke, lavender used in the straw mattress, and the unavoidable scent of lanolin, tanned leather, and dry animal musk. This was a comforting smell. For the primitive part of the brain, the scent of dried hide and preserved animal products was the smell of success. It was the olfactory proof that the hunter had survived, that the group was provisioned, and that the warmth necessary to defeat the night was present. The very odor of the furs served as a deep, subconscious tranquilizer, confirming to the ancient brain that all was well. The interplay with wool, the laps and layers. It is important to remember that the fur was not used alone. The medieval sleeper mastered the art of layering, a technique critical for managing heat and moisture. Beneath the furs were the layers of wool. Wool, derived from sheep but woven rather than used as a raw pelt, was the other great insulator. Wool fibers are naturally crimped and hollow, trapping air just as fur does. Crucially, wool is hygroscopic. It can absorb up to 30% of its weight in moisture without feeling wet. In the damp castle air, this property was invaluable. The wool sheets and blankets would absorb the moisture being exhaled by the sleepers and the dampness wicking up from the mattress, preventing that moisture from condensing onto the skin and chilling the body. The thermal structure of the medieval bed was therefore a strategic arrangement. The base, the straw or herb mattress, Chapter 7, provides bulk and lift. Layer 1, the inner skin. Fine linen sheets, which are smooth against the skin and wick away sweat during momentary overheating. Layer 2, the mid-layer. Heavy woolen blankets, the primary heat trappers. Layer 3, the outer shell. The heavy, tan fur pelts, wolf, bear, or coney, draped over the top, acting as the final, airtight thermal barrier, preventing convective heat loss and radiating a slight, earthy warmth back onto the body. This layering system, perfected through generations of trial and error in cold climates, was a fundamental part of the medieval sleep ritual. It wasn't just about piling things on. It was about the sequence of materials, each one performing a specific thermal task. The survivalist's tax, the danger of dampness, however. The reliance on natural materials brought a persistent, ancient problem. Dampness and pests. As the furs and wool absorbed the damp air of the castle, they became heavy. If not aired regularly, they would become breeding grounds for fleas, lice, and other parasites that had plagued humanity since the first cave shelter. The dampness would also allow molds and mildew to flourish, creating a musty odor and degrading the expensive materials. The medieval sleeper was locked in a constant, low-stakes struggle against the slow decay of their bedding. The frequent airing, beating, and cleaning of the furs and wools, often done on sunny days outside the castle walls, was not merely a matter of hygiene. It was a critical survival task. It was the maintenance required to keep the ancient technology of the fur functioning correctly. If the fur became too damp, it lost its ability to trap air efficiently, and the sleeper was at risk. The furs and pelts, therefore, represent the pinnacle of the medieval solution to cold, using the ancient gifts of the earth to conquer the cold environment of the man-made stone castle. They were the most effective, most luxurious, and most psychologically reassuring element of the bedding. As we move away from the tactile comfort of the fur, we must now turn to the social side of warmth. We have considered the individual's defense, but medieval survival was a collective enterprise. The furs were warm, but the deepest, most abundant source of heat in the castle was entirely free, entirely portable, and entirely human. The next chapter will peel back the curtains to reveal a truth that the modern world has long forgotten. In the Middle Ages, privacy was a luxury, but communal sleeping was a necessity of thermal survival. We have meticulously built the physical and psychological defenses against the cold, the fortress within of the canopy bed, and the insulating shields of furs and wools. Yet, for all this technological ingenuity, the medieval solution to the cold night relied most critically on the oldest and most dependable heat source available, the human body itself. This chapter drifts into the sociological landscape of medieval sleep, exploring a concept utterly alien to the modern mind, the necessity of communal sleeping, where privacy was sacrificed not merely for convenience, but as a crucial strategy for thermal survival. The people of the Middle Ages were, quite literally, each other's primary source of heat. They were the living heaters. The biology of shared warmth. The mammalian huddled. To understand the medieval huddle, we must look at the deepest, most instinctive behavior of warm-blooded social mammals, including ourselves. When ambient temperature drops, the most efficient way for a group to conserve energy and maintain core temperature is to huddle. This simple action dramatically reduces the total surface area exposed to the cold air, minimizing heat loss. In thermal science, the formula for heat loss is directly tied to the surface area of the object. When two people sleep pressed against each other, the two surfaces where they touch are no longer radiating heat out into the cold room. Instead, they are sharing heat. This creates a larger, composite thermal mass that is much harder for the stone giant to cool down. This was the core, non-negotiable logic of communal sleeping in the cold environment of the castle. It was a practice driven by physics, not fashion. The Great Hall barracks, the servants' huddle, the Most pronounced example of this thermal necessity was found not in the Lord's private chamber, but in the great hall, the sprawling, high-ceilinged room where the daily life of the castle unfolded. Whence the feasting tables were cleared. The great hall transformed into the communal sleeping quarters for the majority of the castle population, the foot soldiers, the kitchen staff, the squires, and the general servants. They slept on straw pallets laid directly on the flagstone floor, often using the floor rushes we discussed earlier as an initial, but insufficient, insulator. They possessed only the most basic bedding, a coarse woolen blanket, and maybe a single sheepskin to survive the night. They formed the huddle line. The servants and soldiers would lie down side by side, shoulder to shoulder, in long, dense rows. There was no concept of personal space. The arrangement was a geometric exercise in heat efficiency. They were packed together like sardines, ensuring maximum skin-to-skin or blanket-to-blanket contact. The individuals on the end of the row, whose bodies had a cold, exposed flank, would often rotate positions throughout the night or be assigned the positions based on seniority or physical hardiness. This constant, gentle shifting of bodies, the subtle adjustment of the huddle, was the choreography of survival in the Great Hall. This arrangement also served the primitive, psychological need for safety. Chapter 2. When 50 men are sleeping in a line, the sense of collective security is profound. An unexpected sound, a sudden draft, or the movement of a pest would instantly be registered by the collective, turning the huddle into a living alarm system. The intimate huddle, the Lord's bed, the Great Hall's huddle was born of necessity and rank. But even in the private, elite space of the canopy bed, the concept of communal warmth persisted. The Lord and Lady were almost never truly alone. The bed itself was often occupied by more than 2 people. Small children, particularly infants and toddlers, were routinely placed in the bed with their parents. This practice was not merely emotional. It was thermally critical. A child's smaller body mass makes them lose heat faster, and the safest place for them was nestled between the 2 largest, warmest bodies available, the parents, beyond the family. The chamber's proximity sleepers played a crucial thermal role. The warming pan servant, a servant, perhaps a groom of the chamber or a waiting woman, was often tasked with sleeping on a pallet near the fireplace. Their job was to ensure the banked fire survived the night and to be immediately available to rekindle the fire or heat the warming pans. Chapter 8. In the coldest hours before dawn. Their proximity meant the noble sleepers could rely on them as an emergency heat generator. The chamber dog, hunting dogs, large hounds, and favored lapdogs were prized occupants of the chamber floor. Dogs were effective, naturally insulated, and extremely warm. The heat radiating from a large dog nestled on the floor rushes provided a substantial, localized thermal pocket, often placed strategically near the foot of the bed or the draftiest corner. To sleep with a dog was a custom thousands of years old. Rooted in nomadic survival, the 3-dog night was a recognized standard of warmth. The presence of the servant sleeping near the door, the child in the bed, and the dog on the rushes created a distributed heating network. The entire room, while large and cold, was dotted with concentrated islands of living heat, all contributing to the overall thermal resilience of the sleeping party. The psychology of shared breathing, the act of sharing a bed, or even a small enclosed room, brought a deep, subconscious comfort to the medieval sleeper that transcended simple warmth. The synchronization of life. When people sleep close together, their breathing and heart rates often begin to synchronize. This is a profound, nonverbal signal of trust and collective security. The sound of regular, soft breathing from the people around you, your partner, your child, your guard, is the auditory proof that the group is alive, safe, and at rest. In a world where death from cold, disease, or violence was a constant possibility, The shared rhythm of life provided a sense of calm and stability. This, perhaps more than the physical heat, was the greatest contribution of communal sleeping to the quality of medieval rest. The economic heat tax, paying for warmth, communal sleeping, also represented a fundamental medieval economic equation. Fuel is expensive. Humans are cheap. The colossal amount of wood required to keep the castle warm meant that the lord of the castle had to dedicate a significant portion of his forest resources and manpower, woodcutters, haulers, stackers, just to heating the space. By having dozens of servants sleep together on the great hall floor, the lord saved exponentially on the fuel that would have been needed to keep separate rooms warm. The collective body heat of the servants became a massive, renewable energy source. The medieval economic system literally capitalized on human thermal output. The decline of the huddle, the rise of privacy, the practices of communal and proximate sleeping persisted for centuries. But they began to erode around the late medieval period and into the Renaissance. This was not because the castles became warmer, they did not. It was because social status and privacy began to eclipse survival necessity. As the nobility became wealthier and more powerful, the need to visually distinguish themselves from their servants grew. The desire for a truly private bedchamber where the lord and lady could be alone, without the chamberlain sleeping by the door, became the ultimate sign of status. To afford this privacy, they had to compensate for the lost heat of the human huddle with more expensive technology, thicker curtains, more refined bed warmers, and more logs for the fire. The ability to sleep alone, or just with a spouse, became an economic and social flex, a declaration that they could afford to sacrifice the free thermal energy of the group for the comfort of solitude. But even as privacy became the ideal, the memory of the huddle remained. It reminds us that for thousands of generations, human sleep was not a solitary activity. It was a collective biological function, a shared defense against the cold, dark, and predatory world. As we leave the warmth of the communal huddle, feeling the imagined weight of the bodies pressed close, we must turn our attention to the unsung hero of the medieval bed, the foundation upon which all this thermal engineering was built. The comfort of the fur and the closeness of the group relied entirely on the base layer, the silent, absorbent layer of the mattress. What did they truly sleep on? And how did they manage the persistent, insidious danger of dampness that rose from the cold stone floor? The answer lies in the strategic selection of dried plants and herbs, a technology far more complex than a simple pile of hay. We turn now to the secrets of the straw. We have explored the grand architecture of the stone castle and the subtle architecture of the canopy bed. We have appreciated the thermal prowess of furs and the communal heat generated by the huddle. But all these layers of defense, the wood, the velvet, the hide, were supported by one fundamental, often overlooked layer, the mattress. The medieval mattress was not a passive container for the body. It was an active piece of thermal engineering, a fragrant insulator, and a crucial battleground in the never-ending war against dampness and pests. To call it merely a pile of straw is to profoundly misunderstand the complex, ancient wisdom applied to this essential survival tool. We turn now to the secrets of the straw, the primal bed, the ground's embrace for the earliest humans. A bed was simply a cleared patch of ground, perhaps lined with soft moss, dry leaves, or ferns. The primary requirement was insulation from the cold earth. As early people moved into more permanent structures, huts, and eventually castles, the material used for bedding had to satisfy several, sometimes contradictory, criteria. It needed to be plentiful, soft, insulating, and easily replaceable. Straw and rushes, derived from common agricultural byproducts, met these needs perfectly. But their placement and composition were highly strategic. Function 1. Insulation from below. As established in Chapter 1, the flagstone floor of the castle was a catastrophic heat sink. It was permanently cold and perpetually damp. The primary role of the straw mattress was to create a deep, dry air gap between the cold stone and the warm human body. The mattress was essentially a large bag, or tick, made of coarse canvas or linen, filled with the chosen stuffing. The bulk of the material, the straw, was critical. Straw, made of hollow cereal stems, is an outstanding insulator because, like fur, it traps vast amounts of air in its countless hollow shafts and interstices. A thick straw mattress, perhaps a foot or more deep, provided enough dead air space to effectively decouple the sleeper from the floor's cold. This layer of insulation was the first line of defense against the bone chill that rose up from the stone. Function 2. The battle against dampness. The greater challenge of the mattress was moisture. The floor was damp, the air was damp, and the bodies themselves exhaled moisture. If the straw became wet, it compressed, losing its ability to trap air, and rapidly turned into a cold, rotting mass, the perfect habitat for mold and vermin. Therefore, the material had to be hydrophobic, water-repelling, or easily refreshed. The best materials for mattress stuffing were not just any hay, but oat straw or wheat straw, which had stiffer, less compressible stalks than hay, maintaining loft and trapping air better. However, even the best straw eventually compressed and absorbed moisture. This leads to the crucial ritual of the medieval chamber, the biannual bedding change, twice a year, or perhaps more often in the dampest, poorest areas. The entire contents of the mattress were stripped out and replaced. The old straw, heavy with human oils, moisture, and dust, was carried out and burned or used as compost. This ritual was as necessary as cleaning the chimney. It was a profound acknowledgement of the temporary nature of the bedding and the constant struggle against decay. The fresh, dry straw restored the bed's insulation power and its scent. Function 3. The alchemy of aroma and pest control. Most sophisticated secret of the medieval mattress was the addition of carefully selected herbs, leaves, and rushes. The stuffing was not monomaterial. It was a complex botanical recipe designed to aid sleep, deter pests, and improve sanitation. The addition of certain plants served a triple purpose: aromatics, the smell of cleanliness. Fresh straw has a pleasant earthy scent, but that fades quickly. To mask the inevitable odors of a human dwelling and the damp earth, fragrant herbs were mixed in. Lavender and sweet marjoram were popular for their calming, soothing scents, a medieval form of aromatherapy. The very act of lying down and crushing these herbs released their essential oils, creating a localized, restorative fragrance designed to encourage rest. Pest repellents, the natural pesticide. Fleas and lice were constant companions of the medieval sleeper. Certain herbs were strategically added for their insecticidal or repellent properties. Mint, pennyroyal, wormwood, and tansy were common additions. These strong-smelling herbs deterred insects and small rodents from nesting in the bedding, turning the mattress into a naturally treated barrier. Softness and comfort. For the noble mattresses, straw might be mixed with or replaced by softer, finer materials. Bracken, a type of large fern, was valued in some areas for its softness, and the dried leaves and flowers of heather were prized in Scotland and Ireland for their springy quality and rustic aroma. These additions turned the rough straw into something akin to a high-density, memory foam-like surface, a complex cushion that adapted to the contours of the body. The best mattress was thus a blend, a base of stiff straw for lift and insulation, topped with softer bracken for comfort, and laced throughout with lavender and mint for hygiene and rest. This was far from a random collection of hay. It was a carefully constructed piece of bioengineering. The mystery of the bolster and feather bed, the straw mattress, or palliasse, was the foundation. But above it often lay the luxury layer, the feather bed. Straw was the insulation. The feather bed was the luxury. Made of fine linen and stuffed with the down or small feathers of geese, ducks, or chickens, the featherbed was soft, incredibly warm, and exceedingly expensive. The featherbed was placed above the straw palliasse. This arrangement was strategic. The straw provided the necessary lift and kept the cold air away from the featherbed, which could not withstand the pressure and dampness of the stone floor. The featherbed, insulated by the straw, could then function perfectly, conforming to the sleeper's shape and creating a personalized warm pocket. The bolster, the long, firm cylindrical pillow, was also stuffed with either straw or feathers, depending on wealth. It was designed to span the width of the bed, providing support for multiple sleepers in the huddle. This simple piece of pillow technology allowed multiple people to rest their heads at the correct angle, ensuring that even in a highly communal environment, the neck and head were supported for restorative sleep. The contrast of the rush, we must also briefly return to the floor itself. While the nobles slept on this multi-layered engineered mattress, the castle floor was covered with floor rushes, freshly cut reeds, grasses, and straw scattered loosely. The floor rushes served as the sanitation layer. They were meant to absorb spilled wine, dropped food, and the general detritus and waste of the day. They were trampled, dirty, and smelly, and were changed periodically, usually once every few weeks. This created a sharp, almost shocking sensory contrast. The luxurious, aromatic, high-tech cleanliness of the mattress cocoon, elevated off the ground, standing in stark contrast to the rough, pungent, unsanitary layer of the floor rushes beneath. The higher the nobility, the more drastic the difference, reinforcing the psychological boundary between the safe, warm sleeping space and the cold, dirty, hard world outside the curtains. The secrets of the straw reveal that medieval people were not passive victims of the cold. They were keen observers of natural materials and practical engineers. They understood that the fundamental defense against the stone was not fire, which was too wasteful, but loft and air. This intricate base layer, scented with lavender and protected by mint, provided the necessary support and insulation for the final, critical step in the medieval nightly ritual, the application of localized, targeted heat. We have the bed, the blankets, and the mattress. But even the thickest insulation struggles against the penetrating chill of the hour before dawn. To defeat this final, desperate cold, the medieval sleeper turned to portable thermal technology. We must now leave the herbal scent of the straw and turn our attention to the hearth once more. Not for its grand fire, but for the humble stone, brick, and pan that were heated there, the silent, dangerous technology of the monk's brick. We have established the complete thermal landscape of the medieval sleeper, the fortress of the castle, the cocoon of the canopy bed, the insulation of the furs, and the shared warmth of the communal huddle atop the herbal straw mattress. Yet, for all this sophisticated layering and social engineering, there remained a point of profound vulnerability, the moment of entry into the bed, and the deep chill of the pre-dawn hours. The human body is highly sensitive to the initial shock of cold. Slipping into a bed where the linen sheets have been cooled by the stone chamber air is a jarring, uncomfortable experience that hinders the relaxation needed for sleep. Furthermore, in the early morning hours, before the sun has crested the battlements, the castle reaches its thermal nadir. The fire has died down, the walls are at their coldest saturation point, and the body's metabolism is at its lowest ebb. To conquer these two critical moments of cold, the medieval household perfected a technology of localized, portable heat. We turn now to the humble but crucial technology known variously as the warming pan, the heated brick, and the most persistent form of portable warmth, the monk's brick, the mystery of latent heat, the stone's redemption in earlier chapters. We cast stone as the thermal villain, the stone giant that relentlessly sucked heat from the air. Now, in a fascinating inversion, stone and ceramic become the heroes. utilizing the very principle of thermal mass that had been so problematic. A key principle of physics is latent heat, the energy stored in a mass. While stone absorbs heat slowly, it also releases heat slowly. This slow, steady release was precisely what the medieval sleeper needed. A roaring fire is too intense. It burns out quickly. A gently radiating mass of stone, however, can provide steady, low-level warmth for 6 to 8 hours. The simplest form of this technology was the hot river stone, a smooth, dense stone, perhaps the size of a loaf of bread, was placed directly into the embers of the hearth, or sometimes even buried beneath the hot ash of the banked fire. Chapter 3. It was allowed to heat thoroughly during the evening meal before the lord or lady retired. The stone would be carefully extracted from the fire using tongs, wrapped thickly in a layer of coarse cloth or leather to prevent scalding, and placed beneath the covers. This wrapped stone was, in essence, the very first, most primitive bed warmer. The monk's brick is a historical name often given to this concept, particularly in monasteries where heat was scarce and life was austere. Monks, who adhered to strict schedules and minimal comforts, relied heavily on these heated stones or purpose-made fireclay bricks to combat the cold stone cells. The ritual of heating the brick and carefully placing it in the austere, straw mattress was a necessary act of survival against the icy monastic environment. The evolution of the ceramic warmer as medieval technology improved. The raw stone gave way to purpose-built, highly refined ceramic objects designed to hold and radiate heat more efficiently. These ceramic bed warmers often took the form of small, lidded earthenware or stoneware pots, similar to a modern hot water bottle, but designed to hold embers or hot water. Their design was superior to the raw stone for 2 reasons. Safety. The lid allowed the heat source, embers, hot sand or boiling water, to be contained, minimizing the risk of fire or burning the bedding. Handling. The smooth, glazed ceramic was easier to handle and less likely to snag the fine linen sheets. In wealthy households, the ceramic warmer was often replaced by a brass or copper vessel, a metallic container shaped like a shallow disc with a sturdy, decorative handle. This was the classic warming pan. The process of using the warming pan was a sophisticated and sensory ritual, usually performed by the chamberlains or waiting women just before the lord entered the fortress within. Filling. The metal pan was opened, and a shovel full of glowing, red-hot embers from the banked fireplace was carefully placed inside. Sealing. The lid was quickly snapped shut, often perforated with small holes to allow a tiny, controlled amount of heat and smoke to escape. The sweep. The servant would then rapidly glide the warming pan back and forth across the entire expanse of the bed, beneath the sheets and blankets. The heat radiated from the metal surface, instantly vaporizing the chill and dampness clinging to the bedding. The movement was a slow, mesmerizing sweep, creating a cloud of dry, warm air beneath the covers. This ritual served to preheat the microclimate. It ensured that when the lord or lady finally slipped into the linen sheets, they were not met with the shock of cold fabric, but the comforting warmth of an already established thermal zone. The entire process was designed to smooth the transition into sleep, eliminating the jolt of cold that stimulates the primitive alarm response. The dangers of the heat source. The use of portable heat was not without significant risk. This reliance on heated objects in a bed of dry straw, wool, and linen was a persistent fire hazard, a trade-off the medieval person accepted. Embers and fire. If the warming pan was filled carelessly, or if the lid was loose, a single spark or ember could fall onto the dry straw mattress or the linen sheet. In the dark, this could lead to a slow smoldering that would ignite the bed in the middle of the night. Fire in a castle, especially high up in the keep, was deadly, scalding. The hot stones and ceramic bricks, if not wrapped properly, posed a severe risk of deep thermal burns. The servant performing the warming ritual had to be highly skilled in judging the perfect temperature, hot enough to last the night, but not hot enough to cause injury. Smoke and fumes. If the warming pot was sealed too tightly, or if the embers were not perfectly clean and glowing, the potential for producing toxic fumes, carbon monoxide, was very real. In the sealed, small air volume of the canopy bed, this could lead to the silent, mysterious death of the sleeper. This mystery of death in sleep, often attributed to curses or illness, may have been simple carbon monoxide poisoning. The monk's brick and the warming pan, therefore, represent a moment of high-stakes technological application. They offered the perfect solution to the most persistent problem of cold sleep, but demanded precision, caution, and ritualistic adherence to safety protocols. Thermal strategies for the long night. The portable heat source was not removed once the sleeper was warm. It was placed strategically to last the duration of the long night. At the feet, the largest, warmest object, the heated brick or a container of embers, was often placed at the foot of the bed. The extremities, hands and feet, are the first to cool, as the body pulls blood into the core. By warming the feet, the person experienced a sensation of overall warmth, and the thermal input was maintained for the long hours until dawn. The shared heat. In the communal bed, the heated object became another shared resource. A small sun nestled beneath the covers, radiating warmth into the huddle of bodies and blankets. The life of the monk's brick was its ability to endure. It was a silent thermal clock, steadily releasing its energy, battling the cold, until the sun could once again take over its task. It was the physical embodiment of stored energy, allowing the warmth of the day's fire to be stretched out across the dangerous darkness. This technology represents the final triumph of ingenuity over the environment. By conquering the moment of entry into the bed and reinforcing the thermal envelope during the most critical, cold hour of the morning, the medieval sleeper achieved a level of sustained warmth that would have been impossible through furs and fire alone. As the gentle heat of the monk's brick begins to fade beneath the heavy covers, and the air around it cools, we must turn our attention to the simple, but universally practiced, final layer of defense: the clothes they wore to bed. The medieval person did not rely on bedding alone. They relied on layers of fabric to trap heat close to the skin, a final, personal cocoon of warmth that completed the sleep system. We now leave the hot stone and the brass pan and enter the quiet, folded world of the nightcap and the linen cocoon. We have journeyed through the layered defenses of the medieval sleeping environment: the stone structure, the boxed bed, the insulating furs, and the supplemental warmth of the monk's brick. Yet, all these external measures would be insufficient without the final, most intimate layer of protection: the clothing worn directly against the skin. The medieval sleeper did not rely solely on the bedding to provide warmth. They utilized a sophisticated multi-layered system of sleepwear, designed to minimize heat loss from the body's most vulnerable points. This practice was based on a blend of ancient medical theory and practical thermal physics. We turn now to the secret world of the nightcap and the linen cocoon. The misconception of naked sleep, the modern habit of sleeping nude or in minimal clothing is a luxury afforded by heated rooms and insulated walls. For most of human history, sleeping naked in a cold environment was courting disaster. The moment a person slips out from under the covers, they lose all the accumulated warmth of the bedding. The medieval person, even the high nobility, rarely slept in a state of undress. The first line of defense was the retention of daytime undergarments, and the strategic addition of specialized NIG, HTWEAR. The linen cocoon, the foundation layer. The primary layer of medieval sleepwear was the linen shift for women, or the brise and shirt for men. Linen, woven from the flax plant, seems counterintuitive in a cold castle. Wool, being warmer, might seem more logical. However, Linen served a crucial thermal and hygienic purpose: moisture management. While wool traps heat excellently, it can feel itchy and heavy against the skin when one sweats. Linen, while not as warm, is highly wicking. It draws moisture and sweat away from the skin, preventing the clammy, chilling sensation that occurs when dampness cools against the body. This separation of moisture from the skin was vital for maintaining a consistent, dry warmth. Hygiene barrier. These garments were easily washable, unlike the heavy outer wool and fur garments. By wearing clean linen to bed, the sleeper created a barrier that protected the expensive bedding, the wool blankets and furs, from body oils, dirt, and sweat. This was a critical hygienic strategy. The linen was sacrificed for cleanliness, and the costly bedding was preserved. The linen shift or shirt thus became the linen cocoon, the base layer that maintained a dry, comfortable microclimate immediately next to the skin. It ensured that the heat generated by the body was trapped effectively by the subsequent outer layers, the thermal hat, the nightcaps. Ancient wisdom of all the medieval sleepwear. The nightcap is perhaps the most enduring and visually distinctive symbol, and its function was rooted in solid thermal science mixed with ancient medical belief. The accepted medical theory of the time, rooted in the Greco-Roman concept of humoral theory, held that the body was regulated by 4 primary fluids, humors, and that heat was the essence of life and health. It was believed that the majority of the body's vital heat, particularly the heat in the brain, the seat of rational thought and life, could escape through the head, while the modern understanding of heat loss is more nuanced. The head loses a substantial percentage of heat if the rest of the body is covered, but not necessarily a majority. The practical truth remains: the head is a highly vascularized area, and covering it prevents significant heat radiation. The nightcap, made of soft linen or sometimes padded wool, was designed to seal the vent. It acted as a thermal stopper, preventing the rapid, unguarded escape of heat from the scalp. Muffle sound. The tight cap also served to muffle some of the ambient noise of the castle, the rustling of servants, the howling of the wind, a simple form of auditory comfort that aided in the transition to deep sleep. Prevent hair chill. In an era before frequent washing, keeping the hair contained and protected by a cap was a matter of hygiene, but also thermal comfort. Damp or greasy hair resting on a cold linen pillowcase would chill the head rapidly. The act of donning the nightcap was the final, non-negotiable step in the nightly ritual, the symbolic capping off of the day's heat and the sealing of the body for the vulnerable hours of sleep. Foot's defense. The woven sock. Just as the head was a critical heat loss point, so too were the feet, which, as extremities, often had poorer circulation. The coldness of the feet is one of the most common physical impediments to falling asleep. Therefore, thick knitted woolen socks were essential nightwear. Wool, with its crimped, air-trapping fibers, was perfect for this application. These socks were often long, pulled up past the ankle, and sometimes tied with a garter to ensure they did not slip off the foot during the night. The combination of the monk's brick at the foot of the bed and a layer of thick woolen socks provided a double thermal lock against the chill, ensuring that the critical comfort zone of the extremities was maintained. This attention to the periphery, the head and the feet, was the key to sustaining core warmth throughout the deep sleep cycles. The outer layer, gowns and robes for the wealthiest nobility. An additional, luxurious outer layer was often employed for retiring and rising, the sleeping gown or dressing gown. These were long, loose robes, often lined with fur, rabbit or squirrel, and made of thick wool or velvet. They were not worn under the covers, but were designed for the periods of maximum vulnerability. The journey to bed. Walking from the small, slightly warmer chamber fireplace across the wide, drafty flagstones of the room to the canopy bed was a momentary but intense cold shock. The robe provided insulation for this critical transition. The morning rise, the moment of leaving the accumulated warmth of the canopy bed, was the hardest. The outer sleeping gown was immediately donned the moment the sleeper emerged, protecting them from the freezing air while the servant rekindled the banked fire. This gown was, in essence, a portable fortress within, allowing the sleeper to carry their immediate warmth bubble from the bed to the chair by the hearth without succumbing to the cold. The psychology of wrapping. Ultimately, the medieval practice of layered sleepwear spoke to a deeper psychological imperative, the desire to be completely swaddled. Throughout our history, from infancy, the sensation of being tightly wrapped in soft material, the security of the swaddle is deeply comforting. The layers of linen, wool, and the nightcap all contributed to this sense of being entirely enclosed and protected. The clothing became the final barrier, the ultimate guarantor of warmth that traveled with the sleeper, even if they shifted position or briefly exposed a limb. It was the personal assurance that even if the fire died and the furs slipped, the individual would maintain enough thermal integrity to survive the night. As we draw close on the examination of the clothes and the materials, we are left with the final fascinating piece of the medieval survival puzzle. All these defenses, the stone, the textiles, the heat, required energy. And that energy came from a source that the modern world often forgets when it thinks of sleep: the winter diet. The medieval sleeper did not rely solely on external sources of heat. They fueled an internal furnace. What did they consume right before they lay down in their linen cocoons and pulled their nightcaps tight? The answer lies in a heavy, high-fat, high-spice diet designed not just for flavor, but for a slow, steady burn of metabolic heat throughout the dangerous long hours of darkness. We must now turn to the table and explore the fueling the internal furnace, the winter diet of the nobility. We have meticulously layered the external defenses against the castle's relentless cold: the stone walls, the textile canopy, the furs, the heated bricks, and the linen cocoon. Yet, to truly survive a medieval winter night, the human body could not rely on passive insulation alone. It needed an active internal source of heat, a continuous, slow-burning fire fueled by the food consumed hours before sleep. We now turn from the chamber to the table and examine the strategic necessity behind the rich, heavy, and often spiced meals of the noble class. This was not mere feasting. It was a form of thermal preparation, an ancient dietary strategy designed to stoke the body's metabolic engine. We explore the secrets of fueling the internal furnace, the winter diet of the nobility. The physics of metabolism, the postprandial fire, the process of digestion requires the body to expend energy. This expenditure, known as the thermic effect of food or diet-induced thermogenesis, results in a measurable increase in body heat. The medieval diners intuitively understood this principle. A full, heavy stomach made one feel warm and drowsy. For the medieval noble, facing 8 or more hours of freezing air in a stone box, the last meal of the day, the supper, was not just sustenance. It was an essential dose of thermal energy. To sustain this internal fire for the duration of the long night, the diet had to be rich in 2 key macronutrients: fats and proteins. Fats, the slow burn fuel. Fats take the longest to digest and require the greatest metabolic effort. They provide dense, slow-releasing energy, calories, that sustain the thermic effect over many hours. The medieval noble diet was rich in animal fats: lard, butter, suet, and the rendered fats from game and roasted meats. Consuming a large portion of fat-laden food late in the evening ensured that the digestive system would be actively working, and thus generating heat long after the sleeper had drifted into unconsciousness. Proteins, the digestive engine. High-protein foods, such as roasted beef, venison, pork, and salted fish, also require significant energy to break down. This metabolic effort generates a more sustained heat than the rapid spike provided by simple carbohydrates, sugars. The noble diet, unlike the peasants' reliance on simple grains, prioritized protein precisely because of its sustained heat-generating capacity. The medieval supper was, therefore, an intentional calorie bomb, a blend of high-protein meats and dense fats, all designed to be heavy on the stomach and slow to pass through the digestive system, ensuring the internal furnace remains stoked throughout the coldest hours. The thermal role of spice, internal warmth. Another critical element of the noble winter diet was the liberal, often astonishing, use of spices like ginger, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and pepper were extravagantly expensive, imported from the Far East, and their use was a profound sign of wealth. But their purpose was far more than mere flavor. Many of these spices contain compounds that are vasodilators. They cause blood vessels to widen or are natural irritants, leading to a sensation of internal warmth. When consumed, they immediately activate the body's thermoregulation system, making the diner feel warmer. In the cold great hall, where the external fire was struggling, the perception of internal heat was a powerful psychological and physiological aid. The spiced sauces and rich stews didn't just taste good. They chemically tricked the body into feeling warm and prepared for the cold descent into the bed. Typical winter evening meal might include a thick, heavy meat stew, pottage containing beef, root vegetables, and heavily spiced with ginger and pepper, roast venison or boar, served with a rich, fatty sauce thickened with breadcrumbs and nuts, desserts like gingerbread or spiced fruit tarts, designed to provide a final burst of slow-burning caloric energy and spice. The warming drink, hippocras and mulled wine. The final, non-negotiable component of the nightly thermal preparation was the consumption of warmed, alcoholic beverages. The most common of these was hippocras, a spiced wine made with cinnamon, cloves, ginger, and honey, often strained through a cloth bag, reputedly invented by Hippocrates. Wine, and the addition of alcohol, served multiple thermal functions. Vasodilation. Alcohol is a potent vasodilator. It causes the surface blood vessels, capillaries, to widen, rushing warm blood to the skin. This creates an immediate, intense sensation of warmth and flushing, which is deeply comforting in a cold room. Perceived warmth. The psychological effect is powerful. The individual feels much warmer than they actually are, making the transition to the cold bedroom easier. Sedation. Alcohol also acts as a sedative, aiding the body in transitioning to sleep. This was especially important in a culture where anxiety over the dark and external dangers was a constant reality. However, this practice carried a significant hidden danger. While alcohol makes the skin feel warm, the vasodilation actually causes the body to lose heat faster. The warm blood rush to the surface radiates its heat quickly into the cold air. It is a feeling of warmth achieved at the cost of actual thermal efficiency. The medieval person, not understanding the core temperature drop, accepted the immediate comfort and sedation, making the final glass of heavily spiced, warmed wine a critical part of the nightly ritual, even if it was counterproductive to long-term heat retention. The peasant's contrast, the thin line of survival. Dietary strategy of the nobility stands in stark contrast to the peasant's winter diet. The peasant, who could not afford constant meat, fats, or expensive spices, relied on pottage, a thin porridge made from oats, barley, or peas, often with a small amount of seasonal greens. While filling, this diet was lower in fat and protein, meaning the metabolic fire burned lower and faster. The peasant's reliance on thermal defense was therefore shifted entirely to external strategies, huddling more densely, sleeping closer to the communal fire, and enduring a lower state of nighttime warmth. The ability to afford a rich, high-fat, high-protein supper was literally the difference between a restless, dangerously cold sleep and a comfortable, sustained rest, the final digestion, sleep, and the full stomach. The medieval eating habits were fundamentally different from ours. They generally ate two main meals: dinner, midday, and supper, late afternoon or early evening, just before dark. This timing was intentional. The heavy supper was consumed relatively close to bedtime, often just an hour or two before retiring. This ensured that the digestive system was at its peak activity level, generating the most heat precisely during the initial, critical hours of the sleep cycle. By the time the body's metabolism naturally dips in the deep sleep cycle, around 3 a.m., the slow-burning fats and proteins were still being processed, providing a final push of thermal energy to sustain the body until the monk's brick provided the pre-dawn reinforcement. The entire dietary structure was a functional tool. The food was the fuel, the body was the furnace, and the meal itself was the final act of preparation. As the heavy warmth of the supper fades from the noble's stomach, and the sedative effects of the spiced wine begin to take hold, the entire complex system, the stone, the wood, the textiles, the heat, and the body is finally synchronized. The sleeper is insulated, scented, supported, and internally heated. The final piece of the puzzle is purely visual and structural. The castle walls provided protection, but they needed an intermediary to truly deflect the cold. This intermediary was not fire, but woven fabric, the great hanging tapestries that lined the walls. We must now turn our attention to these woolen murals, often mistaken for mere decoration. To understand their profound thermal role, the ancient insulation technique that finally stopped the stone walls from silently stealing the heat, we turn to the tapestry's job, woolen walls. Against the draft, we have explored the intricate system of medieval thermal survival, addressing every facet from the physics of the stone to the chemistry of the winter diet. Yet, if you look at any depiction of a noble medieval chamber, one element stands out as both magnificent and essential. Often mistakenly viewed as purely aesthetic, the great woven textile hangings that covered the vast expanses of the stone walls. We now turn our attention to the walls themselves, revealing the critical, non-negotiable role of these magnificent pieces of art. Their purpose was not to please the eye, but to save the life of the sleeper. We explore the tapestry's job, woolen walls against the draft. Beyond decoration, the thermal barrier, the medieval tapestry, a thick, heavy piece of woven wool or silk depicting heroic deeds, biblical scenes, or hunting adventures, was an intensely valuable possession. But its high value was justified by its high function. It was, quite simply, the medieval solution to wall insulation. Recall the stone giant, Chapter 1. The 3-foot thick stone wall was permanently cold and perpetually damp. This cold stone radiated a relentless chill into the room through both conduction, direct contact with the air, and radiation, the stone acting as a cold body, absorbing the infrared heat radiating from the human body. Hanging a tapestry was an ingenious, simple, and effective defense against this phenomenon. The tapestry worked in 3 distinct, critical ways: creating the air gap, the thermal break. A tapestry was not hung flush against the wall. It was hung slightly away, creating a vital airspace, usually a gap of an inch or two, between the heavy fabric and the cold stone. This small pocket of trapped air acted as a crucial thermal break. The cold wall could no longer directly cool the air of the room. It could only cool the small pocket of air behind the tapestry. Since air is an excellent insulator, the chilling effect of the stone was dramatically slowed, stopping the convection current, the draft shield. Stone walls, especially in hastily built castles, were never perfectly smooth or airtight. Cold air constantly filtered through tiny gaps, cracks, and fissures in the mortar and around the small window embrasures. This created constant, localized drafts. The thick, heavy woolen weave of the tapestry was highly effective at diffusing, slowing, and stopping this insidious movement of cold air, acting as a flexible, textile dam. Trapping radiant heat, the secondary wall. The tapestry itself became the new interior wall. Its woolen fibers quickly warmed up to the ambient temperature of the chamber, which was warmer than the wall. The material was then far less likely to absorb the radiant heat coming off the people and the hearth. Instead, the tapestry acted as a soft, warm surface, radiating a gentler, more comfortable temperature back into the room. The tapestry, therefore, was a piece of applied physics. It took the three great thermal weaknesses of the stone castle and neutralized them with a hanging blanket of woven wool. The material science of wool. The choice of wool for the warp and weft of these enormous hangings was no accident. Wool, as we discussed in the context of bedding, Chapter 5, possesses unique thermal properties. The fibers are naturally crimped and layered, creating countless tiny air pockets, making wool highly effective at trapping and holding heat. Furthermore, wool is naturally hygroscopic, meaning it can absorb a remarkable amount of moisture, up to 30% of its weight, without feeling wet. In the perpetually damp atmosphere of the castle, the tapestry acted as a giant dehumidifier. It absorbed the moisture that would otherwise condense on the cold stone and turn the chamber air clammy, providing a drier, more comfortable environment for the human body. The use of wool was a concession to reality. The castle would be damp, so the interior furnishings had to be built to manage that dampness. The logistical nightmare. Moving the walls. The tapestries function as movable insulation is proven by their history of travel. Tapestries were rarely permanent fixtures. They were considered part of the furniture and traveled with the nobility when they moved between their different estates and castles. Imagine the enormous logistical effort. A great tapestry could weigh hundreds of pounds and span dozens of square feet. Packing, rolling, transporting, and rehanging these massive woolen walls was a huge undertaking, requiring skilled servants and custom scaffolding. Why endure this labor? Because arriving at a new, unused castle in the depth of winter, where the stone walls had been allowed to cool to an equilibrium with the outside temperature for months, was a death sentence. Without the tapestries, the nobles would have been sleeping in an unmitigated refrigerator. The tapestries were moved because they were essential for survival. They were not art. They were portable climate control systems, the aesthetics of warmth, visual comfort, while the primary function was thermal. The tapestry also served a powerful psychological role, transforming the visual atmosphere of the chamber, softening the fortress. The tapestries covered the harsh, gray, rough-hewn stone, introducing color, narrative, and texture. This act softened the brutal reality of the military bunker, transforming it into a space that felt more human and less aggressively cold. Acoustics. The thick wool was an excellent sound absorber. In a room dominated by hard, echoing stone, the tapestry provided acoustic dampening. It absorbed the echoes of footsteps, the harsh sounds of voices, and the amplified noise of the drafts, creating a much quieter, gentler, and more soothing soundscape, an essential factor for restful sleep. The entire chamber became a sensory management system. The curtains reduced the visual noise of the windows. The straw reduced the smells of the floor. And the tapestries reduced the harshness of the sound and the coldness of the stone. The final mystery of the stone sweat. The tapestry also provided a solution to a subtle, damp mystery of castle life known as stone sweat. When warm, moist air from the fire and human breath hit the surface of the freezing stone wall, it would condense, creating beads of water, the sweat. This constant moisture created ideal conditions for mold, mildew, and general decay. The air gap created by the tapestry trapped the condensation behind the hanging. The tapestry itself, being a poor conductor, stayed slightly warmer and drier on the room-facing side. while the stone behind it continued to sweat. This kept the moisture contained and allowed the rest of the room to remain relatively dry and habitable. The tapestry was the unsung hero, the silent engineer of the medieval home. It was the crucial technological compromise that bridged the gap between the defensive necessity of the stone castle and the biological necessity of human warmth. With the walls successfully insulated, the bed successfully enclosed, and the body successfully fueled, the entire survival system is complete. The medieval person has done everything possible to conquer the night. The final piece of the story is the simplest, yet most profound: the moment of awakening. After hours spent fighting the cold, what did it feel like to emerge from the fortress within and face the inevitable chill of the morning? The final chapter closes the loop, exploring the transition from sleep and the realization that the long, cold night has once again been successfully navigated. We turn now to the morning thaw, surviving the transition to dawn. The night has passed. The stone giant's breath was held at bay by layers of wool, the vigilance of the nightcap, the heat of the monk's brick, and the slow-burning fuel of the winter supper. The castle, that massive cold geological entity, sits in the deep stillness of the pre-dawn hour, the thermal low point of the 24-hour cycle. We have explored the intricate system of defenses that allowed our ancestors to drift into slumber. Now we witness the final, critical act of survival. The morning thaw, the transition from the warmth of the fortress within back into the frigid, damp reality of the medieval world. This moment of awakening was not a gentle rising. It was a sensory jolt, a ritualistic transition from safety to daily vigilance. The dawn of cold, the thermal navigé, the coldest time of the night, regardless of the season, is almost always the hour just before the sun appears above the horizon. The castle walls have radiated heat outwards all night long, reaching their maximum chill saturation. The banked fire in the hearth is a ghost of red ash, its thermal contribution long exhausted. The monk's brick, once a gentle furnace, is now merely a cool, smooth stone. The sleeper, roused by the first pale light filtering through the window shutters, or perhaps by the ritualistic arrival of the chamber servant, experiences the contrast instantly. Inside the canopy bed, the air is stale, warm, and humid, a lingering echo of the night's shared breath. But outside the curtains, the stone chamber air is intensely, sharply cold. The first decision of the day is often the hardest. Do I stay or do I face the cold? The fire ceremony, reigniting the heart. The first ritual of the morning was not performed by the lord or lady, but by the chamber grooms or servants who slept on pallets nearby. Their primary non-negotiable task was the rekindling of the hearth. Creeping out of their own cold bedding, they would move immediately to the fireplace. The process was a study in efficiency and necessity. The unveiling. The servant would carefully sweep away the thick layer of ash that had protected the banked embers. If the banking was successful, a small, stubborn, bright red core of heat, the sacred fire, would still be glowing. The revitalization. Small, dry sticks and slivers of tinder, often birch bark or dried moss, were carefully placed over the embers. The servant would then kneel and gently blow onto the base of the fire. The first crackle, the sound of the first genuine flame catching the kindling, a dry, quick crackling sound, was the sound of victory. It was the signal that the thermal battle had been won, and that the heat source for the day was secured. This fire ceremony was the first piece of the morning thaw. The newly awakened flames did not immediately warm the entire chamber, but they provided a tiny, intense zone of radiant heat, a focal point around which the day's activities could begin. The great reveal, drawing the curtains only. When the fire was safely rekindled and spitting warmth, did the lord or lady emerge. The ritual began with the drawing of the curtains, the great reveal. The heavy wool and velvet drapes were pulled back, allowing the frigid air of the room to immediately mix with the warm air of the bedbox. The sudden exchange of air was a shock. The warm breath that had been so comforting all night now dissipated instantly into the vast, cold volume of the chamber. The noble, wearing their linen shift and woolen nightcap, Chapter 9, would immediately stand on the thick bedside rug, often a sheepskin or tapestry fragment, to avoid the shock of the freezing flagstone floor. The sleep-in gown, placed strategically nearby, was donned immediately, providing a portable layer of warmth for the journey from the bed to the slowly heating hearth. Sensory shock, water and the ice. The most intense sensory experience of the morning was the ritual of washing. Personal hygiene was rudimentary by modern standards, but a basin of water was essential. The water, drawn from a well or cistern, would often have been sitting in the chamber all night. The servant would bring a small basin for the morning ablutions. If the cold had been particularly severe, the sleeper would often observe a thin sheet of ice across the surface of the water in the basin. The medieval sleeper had to break this ice to wash their face and hands. The cold shock of the water was immense, a sharp, almost painful sensation that served as an immediate, involuntary stimulant, snapping the body from the warmth of sleep into full, cold awareness. This shock was accepted as a necessary evil. It was the body's payment for the night's safety, a physical reminder of the brutal environment they were living in, the proof of survival. A ritual of gratitude, the entire morning sequence, the rekindling of the flame, the pulling of the curtains, the breaking of the ice was subconsciously a ritual of gratitude and successful survival. The medieval sleeper, living in a world of high mortality, disease, and unpredictable weather, understood that simply waking up was a triumph. The successful passage of the long cold darkness was not guaranteed. The sight of the fire, the sound of the crackling wood, the feel of the woolen gown, and the rush of blood from the cold water all affirmed the same fact. The life within me has conquered the forces of the stone giant and the long winter night. The final act of the morning thaw was the consumption of the first meal, the janiculum or breakfast, often taken right by the hearth. This meal was typically light, perhaps stale bread dipped in wine or ale, or a warm bowl of pottage. This warm, early meal served to immediately begin stoking the internal furnace, Chapter 10, reversing the metabolic dip of the night and preparing the body for the physical labor and vigilance of the coming day. The heat generated by this simple breakfast acted as the perfect, smooth handoff from the fading thermal energy of the monk's brick. Conclusion. The triumph of ingenuity. We began this journey by imagining the dread of the cold medieval night. We end it by recognizing the profound ingenuity of the medieval person. They did not conquer the cold with a single, sweeping invention. They conquered it with layers of stone, layers of textile, layers of people, layers of fat, and layers of ritual. They understood that ultimate comfort was impossible, but consistent survival was achievable through a strategic, calculated effort that blended ancient mammalian instinct with evolving architectural science. The answer to the question, how did people sleep in medieval castles without freezing to death, is not found in a single secret, but in a holistic, fascinating system of survival. They built the fortress within a fortress, Chapter 4, to create a microclimate. They used skins of the beast, Chapter 5, to trap air and prevent conduction. They employed the living heaters, Chapter 6, to share metabolic warmth that they fueled the internal furnace. Chapter 10, with rich foods. They covered the cold stone with woolen walls. Chapter 11, to stop the draft. They survived not by luck, but by turning every single element of their environment, from the herbs in their mattress to the direction of their winding staircases, into a strategic part of their thermal resilience plan. And so, as the sun finally breaches the arrow loops, casting a pale yellow light across the freshly lit hearth. The castle officially shifts from a sleeping bunker back into a bustling fortress. The long, silent struggle is over for another day, and the human story of survival, once again, continues.